Good morning and welcome to a live version of the game where this is our election preview. We'll be on live election night here on this very station or whatever you want to call it since it's online now. I'm Mark Simon, happy to be joined by my partners, Kevin Mullin and Melissa Michelson. Hi gang, it's good to see you. What a year.
Morning.
Let's just talk a little bit generally about what kind of year has 2020 been. And it's like, it's first of all, I guess it's the year that never seems to end. But Kevin, give us sort of your overview, your political overview of 2020.
Well, extraordinary. I'm 50. I've never seen anything like this, and I'm an elections junkie. An electorate that is totally mobilized and energized, even though there's a general feeling that California will certainly go for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in this cycle. The turnout, the early vote, has been extraordinary. And we've already matched, I believe, the 2016 early vote. And we still have 11 days to go until Election Day. So I'm following this on a daily basis through political data, PDI, and they're sending continual updates about how many early votes are being cast. And the pace is going to shatter records here. I really believe this will be the highest turnout ever in California. So there's just that underlying dynamic. Of course, you've got the backdrop of a pandemic, a very serious recession. I feel the weight of this election. I think people feel as though they are really voting to, in some sense, save democracy, keep the republic together as we've known it. And it really feels like history is at play here. And we always say every 4 years, oh, this will be the most important election of our lifetime. This actually will be the most important election of our lifetime. I believe that in my bones. And I think you're going to see that in the turnout. And and with such high Democratic turnout, I think it's going to make some of the early prognostications about the propositions and so forth. Really, there's just a lot of guesswork because there's a lot of people who will be casting votes who may have never voted before.
Melissa, is there anything we can conclude about, I mean, sort of to Kevin's point, we always have an idea of who's showing up based on past election patterns, but this one may break all the patterns. Is there, you're a political scientist, are there any sort of discernments you can make about how the electorate might be different this time? Is it going to be more heavily minority? We've all been waiting in California for the Latino vote, the sleeping giant, to awaken. And then the president goes on TV again last night and says stuff that, has got to energize people. What's your feeling about who's showing up and how different might this vote be than than we've had in the past?
Yeah, well, as Kevin mentioned, overall, there's just a lot more enthusiasm about voting, heavy amounts of early voting, large numbers of people expressing interest in voting. And I think we're going to see really high turnout, not just among Latinx voters, but other historically marginalized communities. And I think we're going to see record turnout among youth. I think for youth, they are concerned about the future of democracy. They see this as a very important election. I think what has happened to everyone in the past 4 years is there's a new appreciation for the importance of voting, the importance of being engaged. And for young people, they're seeing, old people have kind of left us with a mess, and it's time for us to start voting and to take some action. And, if we don't vote and do something about climate change, nobody's going to. So I think we're going to see unprecedented levels of youth turnout and unprecedented levels of turnout also in historically marginalized communities, whether that's Latinx communities or Asian Pacific Islander communities.
Now we have, I think everybody is suffering from what I think of as a 2016 hangover. Lots of people thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. She didn't win. Some of it is a series of almost flukish events, starting with 40 years of people hating on her as long as she'd been in public life. The FBI announcement, some of the places she chose to campaign late when she should have been somewhere else. The fact that I don't think she ever came up with sort of a sustaining, winnable theme for her campaign, but it's made everybody gun shy. Melissa, my sense is when you start looking at the things you're talking about, turnout from people who didn't show up in 2016. There are people we know who have been waiting 4 years to vote in this election and who are almost like charging to the voting booth or charging to the mailbox. All of
Yeah,
my
not just
political
people who
instincts tell.
didn't vote. Sorry.
Go ahead,
Not
go
just
ahead.
people who didn't vote, but people who voted third party and then
Hmm.
now maybe regret that. And so we're seeing fewer people saying that they're going to vote green or libertarian and really getting it that the way our system is set up, you got to pick between the two major party candidates. So you got a lot of people voting for the first time, as you mentioned, a lot of people waiting, like with bated breath, like I am going to vote, and also people becoming citizens who maybe had resisted going through the naturalization process, maybe because of the expense, but now after 2016 thinking, nope, I have got to do this. And so we're seeing higher levels of interest in voting among people who have sat out their whole lives despite being eligible. And then also people having a greater appreciation for what their vote might actually mean, that they do have to think carefully about how they're choosing. So that
Yeah,
hangover is having a lot of effects.
yeah. So Kevin, if if it turns out to be the kind of decisive victory for Biden that all the data suggests it will be, is there a blue wave this year? Because they're also talking about gains for the Democrats in the House, uh, flipping the Senate. In the legislature, they're talking about the supermajority being added to in the legislature. What's your sense of a blue wave coming this year?
There's no doubt there's a blue wave. And the question will come down to the U.S. Senate, how many of those seats flip. I'm not an expert at following the U.S. Senate, but I've been around long enough to know when there's going to be a wave, and this is it. However, you do have mobilized voters on the right. Trump maintains a level of support and intensity of support among his followers. So I don't think you have an absolute runaway in the presidential race. You know, the average of polls has it about 8 points right now. You probably see something along those lines in terms of the popular vote, but as we know, it gets down to state by state in the Electoral College. But there's a tremendous updraft just on turnout, and you can feel it. Now, granted, we're in California, but I really do think if you look at the early voting numbers nationally, that is an indicator of an energized electorate. And you always have a higher Democratic turnout in presidential years, period. That's a rule, basically a political rule of progressive politics. But this year is going to be exceptional, I think. In terms of the supermajorities in the Assembly and the Senate, it's hard to say. I think it's a tough year to be a Republican in California, and I think what gives me the most apprehension is, and we've talked about this in the past a little bit, just the dynamics of the voting machinery and mechanisms in this cycle. If I had one thing that keeps me up at 3 in the morning about the presidential contest, for example, is the number of states that are moving toward voting by mail because of the pandemic, but aren't expert at voting by mail. And there are a variety of issues around signature verification, nuances to voting by mail. And you've got messages from the president saying you can't trust vote by mail. And all of these ballots out there and voter fraud, and we all know voter fraud is minuscule, but just questions that may emerge in the days after the election before we have final results as vote by mail ballots continue to be tabulated. Sort of what happens in that period, that gives me some anxiety about how this may all play out.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's something we've experienced, including on our election night show, that election night doesn't mean what it used to mean. That you have to be, and I think California is more ready for this. if it's close, it's going to be 3 weeks, and you just have to learn to accept that. And it doesn't mean there's some skullduggery going on, or somebody's in some back room suddenly discovering, oh, look, there's a whole new pile of ballots that we hadn't counted before. It's just that's what it takes, because in fact, the 3 weeks ought to be reassuring, because it means they're validating the vote. The fact is, the faster you quote, I used to associate a fast count with credibility, but now you're beginning to understand the faster they count, the more suspicious you probably ought to be. Melissa, is there going to be any legs to this question of the validity of the vote? And I know it's a tough prediction to make, but what is your sense?
It depends. My sense is that if it is close, if it's not a blowout for one of the other candidates, and of course it is more likely it'll be a blowout for Biden, then so if it's close, I think then people will be more suspicious, and they'll maybe be more open to thinking something funny is going on with these late counts, and then it's all going illegal, and then we're all having flashbacks to 2000 and Chad and hand counts. But if it's a big win, which it possibly could be based on which polls and which forecasts you're looking at, then I think it's less likely that's going to be an issue. And so both sides are gearing up their legal teams. They are already in the courts. We've already seen multiple decisions from the courts that are influencing how votes are being counted and when, and that will continue. And I do think it's important to reassure folks, like, this is proof that voting is legitimate and that votes are being carefully counted, and not that the slowness, right? Rushing things is not great. But most Americans are used to having a winner on election night. And so that's a new thing to get used to. We're all getting used to a lot of new things in a pandemic. And maybe that's just one more thing we need to get used to. We want to be able to vote safely. You want to be able to vote by mail so that we can minimize infections. Well, then you got to give up that thing where you have a party that night because you know who won.
Yeah, Kevin, you and some of your colleagues got out in front of let's do vote by mail. And I want to put in a plug, not just for you, although I do appreciate the fact that you were at the front of that. But if you look at the ways votes can be hacked, voting by mail is actually even more secure because it's a paper ballot. It's almost a throwback to the days when you went somewhere, filled in the thing and stuffed it in a ballot box somewhere. So but it's more secure. What is your sense? Is there going to be? I mean, they're going to try and create mischief no matter what happens. But it does look as though the country itself, the pandemic has sort of forced everybody to look at modernizing in almost uniformity in how we vote.
Right. So a couple thoughts on that. I think we are learning, in spite of the security of vote by mail, and we've done it right here in San Mateo County. Even with all of those, that experience and the protections, there were 100,000 ballots in the March primary that weren't counted because people wouldn't sign the back of the ballot, for example, didn't sign the back of the ballot, or they arrived too late to be counted. We've made some adjustments in the law, for example, in California, to ballots still have to be postmarked by Election Day, but there are a period of 17 days where those votes can be counted. They still have to be postmarked and received by Election Day, but it accounts for delays in the mail, for example. We're ensuring that those votes are properly counted, and we have a process where local registrars contact somebody if there's an issue with their signature, so they can update their signature that the registrars have on file. But see, all of those little nuances we have experience with in California. That's not necessarily the case across the country, and you have some Republican secretaries of state. I'm learning that in Texas, there was a proposal to have one drop box per county. In some counties are like 5 million people. You have one official
That was upheld by the courts. That happened. That happened.
Right. So these are active voter suppression strategies out there. Whereas we're taking the tack like we want to include ballots, we want those legitimate votes to count. There are folks making it harder and harder to vote out there. So this is very much an open question mark. And I'm an elections junkie, but I'm struck by just the variability, the variation across states and the variation across counties on just the mechanisms of voting. I mean, I think we're learning that we have just an antiquated way of doing this across the country. Elections machinery is underfunded. Even with HAVA after the Bush Gore 2000 debacle, these systems are underfunded. And we need more money to modernize the elections infrastructure across the country. Congress needs to be involved. The states need to be involved. We need to have a modern 21st century voting process for a 21st century democracy. And this is really opening people's eyes, I think, we just need to pay more attention to that, because you want the elections results to be validated and for people to have trust in them. I do in California, but I know that's not the case across the country. So lots of question marks, I think, and it's going to be very much a study in how elections work or maybe don't work properly across the country.
Yeah. Well, all I know is that if when your ballot comes with directions, I always think of Calvin and Hobbes, who said, directions are for sissies. Let's move on to some of the California
Toxic masculinity alert.
Calvin, not me. Actually, I got one of the cards telling my signature had changed a lot since I was 18, and maybe I ought to come in and file a new card, which I was actually very, very much appreciated. Let's talk about the statewide measures. The one that we all thought was going to attract the most attention is Proposition 15, which was the first real attempt to make a significant change to Prop 13. It changes how commercial property is assessed so that it begins to pick up the load that it used to carry back before Prop 13. And so much of the shift of property tax revenues has shifted to residential property, which has also required cities to do things like increase the sales tax, increase hotel taxes, stuff like that, and fees. That looks like it's too close to call. Kevin, let me start there, because I think both of us never thought that an attempt to take on Prop, given how politically toxic it was, would even get this far. What are your thoughts on Prop 15?
Yeah, so it's like 49-44 right now. Yes is +5 in the latest poll that I saw, the Public Policy Institute California poll. So I think there's a chance 15 passes with the right kind of turnout model. So I think the campaign has done a good job of really emphasizing this is split roll. This is addressing the corporate side of Proposition 13, that the residential side of Proposition 13 is not being touched. I mean, that's always been the primary concern with split roll, is that the opposition campaign would point to this is just the first step. They're going to go after your residential Prop 13 tax rates next. And there's been some of that, but the opposition, as I can detect it, is talking about the impacts on relatively smaller business owners that own warehouses, for example, that might be reassessed to market value, and what some of the impacts might be on consumers. So you're not, at least I'm not really hearing too much about residential Prop 13s next. It's really more about, okay, how will this work in practice, and which business owners would be impacted by this, and will you, the consumer, wind up paying more? The reality is, and I'm supporting Proposition 15. I think it's narrowly crafted enough to target the larger corporations who've been exploiting a loophole in Prop 13 for decades now. It will generate $9 billion, $9 or $10 billion a year, as we're learning in a state with a $54 billion projected deficit. We are going to need funds to maintain education spending and higher ed spending and healthcare spending and so forth. So I think it's going to be, I think that's going to wind up being a nail biter. What we're seeing is in the votes, and I've been following this pretty closely, is the early vote is trending Democratic. that election day voters may trend a little more conservative, that Republicans, based on some messaging that they're hearing nationally, aren't necessarily voting by mail in the numbers they traditionally have, that they may be waiting until election day to go up in person to those vote centers. So the polling, it feels inherently unpredictable given the level of turnout on the Democratic side in California, sort of what's going to happen. So on our election night coverage, I will be focusing on the whole slate of props because I do think we're going to have a pretty decent idea at 8:05 as the numbers from the 58 counties come in, really what those trends look like for these props, because all of the early vote will be counted and released, and the same day vote center vote will be released as well at 8:05, because we don't have those neighborhood level polling places. We have consolidated vote centers, and there's going to be, I think, those results get uploaded pretty quickly. So we'll know in that 8 o'clock hour, I think, which props look like they're going to prevail. However, the caveat is if they're close, we may not know for weeks, because the vote by mail that come in late, those updates will happen over the course of really probably 3 weeks if you have a really, really close measure.
Yeah, Kevin said earlier he's kind of an elections geek. Boy, if you needed evidence of it, you should have seen him answer that question. I want to move on to Prop 18, and Melissa, have you take a crack at it first, because you do teach college age kids, and you're interested in this particular area as one of the areas you spend a lot of time studying. This is a measure that is authored by our friend Kevin Mullin, that would allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primary if they turn 18 by election day for the general. So basically, you're saying, okay, if you're going to vote in the November election, you want to have a chance to influence who your choices are in November. What is your sense of how important this might be, and how many people it might enfranchise if we do it that way? And then I can talk to Kevin about how the campaign stands.
I have definitely been talking about Prop 18 with my students, and they love it. I have to say, it makes a lot of sense to them, right? A lot of them are looking towards voting for the first time, and some of them were not old enough to vote in the primary. And for them, it makes sense. And maybe they were very excited to vote for somebody other than Joe Biden or Donald Trump not this year. Maybe they were very excited to vote for somebody else in that primary or a different primary, but instead they just had to let everyone else make the decision for them. And so it's to them, it makes a lot of sense. And the way we've been talking about it in classes, we've really been making a parallel to Jim Crow white primaries, where Black people got the vote, and so they could cast a vote in a general election because those were controlled by the federal government. But especially in the South, Jim Crow laws established whites-only primaries. And so only white people would choose the nominees. And so sure, Black people, go ahead and vote in November. Choose among these lovely white people that we have selected for you as the nominees. And so it was enfranchisement without power. And so I think it's really very much the same thing. It doesn't do you much good to get a vote in November when your choices have been narrowed down to two, when maybe you could have influenced the choice if you had had the opportunity to participate in the primary. And we're talking about, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of young people who come of age in those few months between the primary and the election. So, in the general election. So I think it's a big deal. And it's also more than the numbers, it's just the symbolism of it, which is, it really doesn't empower you to have the vote in a general if you didn't get to choose the nominees.
This was an idea that was originally promulgated by Kevin's father, Gene, when he was in the assembly after decades as a political science teacher, a revered political science teacher, I should say, at South San Francisco High School. My late wife had him as a teacher, and she loved him. And that's the idea that you're in this classroom teaching civics, trying to tell people it's important for you to participate, and then telling them, but not you, not yet, even though you get to participate later. And it's an interesting dichotomy of views, I suppose. Kevin, what is the How's it look? Because it's an interesting message because it's complicated. It isn't a simple, 5 words and you're done sort of explanation for people.
Right. And that has been our challenge, very honestly. I think people are resistant to an across the board lowering of the voting age to 17, that there might be some legal or constitutional issues with that. But 19 other states across the country allow those 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they'll be 18 by the general, for all the reasons that Professor Michelson cited. Is you're looking at that election as a cycle, that if you're going to be voting on those candidates in general, you ought to have a chance to shape the field of candidates in the primary. But there is an educational element to that where you have to educate the voters about what primaries are, and that you're looking at it as a cycle, and they absolutely have to be anchored. It's linked to those young people becoming 18. The campaign, we're in a dead heat essentially, maybe a few points ahead. It's going to be very close, though. We are hoping that this is energizing for young people, younger voters. And for the reasons, Mark, you cited that classroom setting. We were just having a conversation about the mechanics of casting a vote in a vote by mail environment where you have to sign the back of the ballot and those kinds of things. A classroom setting is an ideal place to be talking about the importance of voting, the history of the vote, and that's an incredible example that the professor gave, a historical example. You could be talking about those kinds of things in a classroom setting like the professor does for her college students, but you could be doing that for high school seniors as well. So I'm encouraged. I think this is an idea whose time has come in California, especially in light of the fact that it's happening in so-called red and blue states across the country, and working and enfranchising young people. And we know that voting is habit forming. So once a young person casts a ballot, they're more inclined to do so again. So I think it's a good thing for democracy. It's time for California to join the ranks of the states that allow this. But I'm also this is the first statewide election that I've been this involved in, and it is daunting. 21 million ballots out there, and we have a campaign budget right now. I think we've raised about $700,000, which it sounds like a lot of money to me, but it's relative
No.
peanuts.
It's really not.
Relative peanuts in terms of reaching a statewide electorate when you've got hundreds of millions being poured in say, Proposition 22, for example. So we are really relying on grassroots, and word of mouth isn't enough to get it done in California. So we're doing digital advertisements and so forth. But you just get an appreciation for how big this state is when you're trying to communicate a message like this. So our fingers are crossed, and I'm going to stay optimistic that we have a good result on election night.
Well, if you had $700,000, you could be a real player in Montana. You're just in the wrong state, Kevin. And we're going to be doing this on election night. All three of us will be there. If Kevin looks a little nervous from time to time, now you'll understand why. I do want to touch briefly on Prop 22 because that's the one where all the money has been spent. I didn't think about it that way, but it's like it is far and away by a factor of like 5 a record-setting amount of money being spent. I have to tell you, I did some funny research. I got a piece in the mail that said like 60% of app-based drivers favor Prop 22. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I went on their website because it gives you an idea. We're all geeks, right? Where's that survey come from? And it was some guy named the rideshare guy who has a blog who queried like 600 of his followers. And that's how it came. It's like, but this is an independent survey. So it shows you how eager they are to get this passed.
This is why we teach
on
critical thinking in college.
That's right. Yeah, you really ought to question some of these numbers you see when you see them. What is your take on this measure, Melissa?
Well, I think it's a really good example of how money is used to obfuscate and confuse, right? Any campaign consultant on a proposition will tell you the best way to win a no is to confuse everybody because voting no leaves everything the same. So getting a yes vote is very difficult. And so the massive amounts of money that we're seeing are a sign of just, well, It's a sign of multiple things. It's a sign of how propositions were brought to California as a way to empower regular people, but it's really a tool of the wealthy and big corporations. All of the messaging that's going back and forth is a sign of how making law by proposition is maybe not ideal and is really overtaxing the voters in terms of they then have to really do a lot of research, do a lot of homework to figure out which way they want to vote. And this is one of the ones that when my family and I sat down to vote, took us a long time to research because the messages that you're getting are really, it's so complicated. But number one, I think what this is evidence of is just maybe how out of control the role of money in proposition campaigns. That $200 million can be spent on this little issue. It's, I think it can't be good for American democracy.
By a group of businesses whose main concern is overpaying their employees. So they certainly had the money. What you just said something I think is an important point about another reason why vote by mail is so good. You're not standing in a voting booth thinking, gee, I really haven't thought about this measure. You can take the time to do some research before you vote. Kevin, I'm going to switch gears and start talking about what's going on in San Mateo County. By my count, it is the biggest ballot in our history in terms of the sheer volume of people running for school boards and for city councils. Some of that is because of the proliferation of district elections. But does some of it also signal, again, what the kind of political environment we're in, that there's just more activism at every level, including the local level?
Yeah, so I'm going to say it's an all of the above. Okay, so we've got a consolidation of municipal elections to even years. That movement is happening. There will be very few off-year elections going forward. There really is a grouping of elections now in even years, and that can be debated. Some would prefer that municipal elections sort of stand alone from the presidential cycle. Others, and I would count myself among this group, think it's good for democracy to have these local offices voted during a cycle where there's the highest turnout. You're going to have more people participating in this election cycle and hopefully learning about who their local officials are and what's at stake in their own home communities. But so you have just more races consolidated into a presidential cycle. You have district elections creating that dynamic and so many different ballot types, actually, when you have district elections. And you add to it, to your point, Mark, I have never seen, and I've been at this a while. I sound like the wise old man all of a sudden. But I've been following this for quite some time. I've never seen more energy on the local level. Mark, you can give an even deeper historical perspective on this, but I see
I'm so
this
much older than you. Yes.
I see this abundance of like local talent. I see a lot of talent coming up the ranks, and that's a good thing for this county to have this level of energy and the sophistication of the kinds of campaigns that are being run on the local level is pretty remarkable. So you're going to have this record-breaking cycle of engagement, and as a not only an elections junkie but a democracy junkie, I think this is great for our democracy, and I think it's great for our county to see the kinds of candidates that are coming forward, and hopefully we diversify the elected boards in the county so they look more like the population as a whole. And I know Melissa, the professor's done some great work on that front. So hopefully we see some of those results come through as well in this kind of a cycle.
That's another effect of moving to even year elections. Not only is turnout higher, but turnout among people of color tends to be higher. So Black and Latinx and Asian Pacific Islander Americans are more likely to vote if it's a big salient, presidential election or midterm election. So not only is turnout lower when you have those municipal elections in odd numbered years, but the electorate tends to be whiter. And so what that means, of course, is that then the folks who get elected are whiter. right, are more likely to be white. And so I think what Kevin is saying is exactly right. We are going to see more diversity in who is elected to these offices by moving to on-year elections. And then at the same time, as we were just talking about, not only is interest in voting exploded in the last few years, but interest in running for something has exploded. Far more young people, far more women, far more LGBTQ people are looking to run for office. And so you're seeing bigger pools of folks deciding that they're going to run for office, and not the more traditional candidates who tended to be white cisgender men.
Well, what's interesting is we've gone through what is actually sort of a quiet period of dramatic reform of our local political system, which is we have district elections, which removes a huge threshold for somebody deciding to run. We've got, in Redwood City is the most notable example, we've got young people running, we've got LGBTQ people running, we've got people running who are taking positions that historically would have been sort of dead on arrival positions on certain issues. But because they're running in a district, maybe there's a little more traction for that issue than there would have been. So there's that. Cities increasingly are adopting spending caps, which also removes another major threshold or a major advantage that the establishment would have. And so what you're also seeing, I think, Melissa, as a result of that is issues are being brought up that would not have been brought up. And I want to touch on this and ask you about it in particular. Having covered some of these local campaigns, it seems to me that ethnic diversity, ethnic representation, racial equity and equitability, and Black Lives Matter has been on the agenda of every campaign when when we all know, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, it would never have even come up. Is this a passing fancy reflecting the times, or is it something you think because of the combination of these other reforms, these are issues that are going to have some sustainability?
I don't know to what degree it's because of the reforms. I think we're living in a moment of racial reconciliation where we're all confronting racism and institutionalized racism to a degree that we really haven't in the past. And whether that's because of Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or any other large number of incidents, there has been like a turning point where people are finally thinking like, well, this is really an issue. And I think that's in part a reflection of the increased attention to politics by young people, increased engagement in communities of color and youth of color. So I don't know that that will last, right? Yes, these reforms are long lasting and maybe we'll continue to have attention to local issues or issues that would normally not get a lot of traction. But I think the attention to racism, institutionalized racism, police reform, and accountability, I think that's very much a reflection of the peaking of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been around since 2013, but somehow this year has really caught fire.
Kevin, are there any local issues that you're facing? I'm focused particularly on measures R and Y in San Mateo. Y is the extension of a now 30-year-old height limit for another 10 years that caps height in San Mateo at 55 feet. Measure R was put on by the council, and it allows significantly higher buildings, but only near Caltrain stations. And that, one of the sustaining themes I write about in my column all the time is change versus the status quo, and the Peninsula becoming a more urbanized environment, much to the objection of many people who've lived here a long time and still want the white picket fence and the nice lawn and don't want high-rise buildings even in their downtown. So to me, that's old versus new sort of discussion there. And I'm teeing that up for you, although you're free to take this conversation anywhere you want. But are there any issues you're following closely, and are you following that one in particular?
I am following that, and I'm struck by the number of candidates willing to talk about the need for increased density. And I think the politics have moved on this question of affordable housing and growth. Increasing, albeit maybe a begrudging acknowledgement in some regard, but definitely an acknowledgement that We are a job center in San Mateo County, and we're not providing enough housing. It's really about sort of how we go about addressing that jobs housing imbalance, but more candidates willing to step up and say, hey, we do need to build more affordable housing. That doesn't seem like a huge thing, but I know that it was a touchy subject when I ran for office in 2007 on the local level. There were, a handful of us willing to talk about the need for more density, but it's a politically tricky thing to do, and still is to some regard, in some regard. But I think there's a growing recognition of the need to do something about that jobs housing imbalance. So yeah, I'm absolutely watching that. You mentioned the growth at the Caltrain station. I'm going to be watching very closely the results on Measure RR, the Caltrain 1/8 cent sales tax on the ballot in San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties. A little bit of a tortured path for this sales tax measure to get to the ballot. It's a topic for another discussion, sort of the discussions among local officials in the three counties about who really controls Caltrain, and San Mateo County sort of being pinched between these two big poles, San Francisco and San Jose in the south. Lots of local politics being played out on that front. However, everybody's sort of holding hands and pushing in the right direction on this to get a dedicated revenue stream for Caltrain, which, Caltrain is in financial dire straits right now because of the pandemic, because of decreased ridership, but it absolutely is this crucial commuter backbone. Mark, I don't need to tell you that. You've got a history with Caltrain, but when the economic recovery kicks in and people are back going to the office, maybe not every day, maybe there'll be a hybrid model where people work from home some days and go to the office other days. It's still going to be this crucial link for us on the peninsula, but this would be the opportunity, and this is the ballot when you're talking about the level of turnout we are seeing just in that three county area. I think it's going to be successful, but it's certainly one to watch, and we'll sort of know how close this thing's going to be at 8:05. So we'll definitely be reporting on that on our show.
You mentioned San Mateo County as a job center, which of course it wasn't. One of the things I found in the Prop 15 ballot arguments, or the analysis by the Legislative Analyst's Office, the increase in property tax revenue if Prop 15 passes will be greater in San Mateo County than it would in San Francisco, which tells you there's more commercial property here than there is in San Francisco, which confounds the normal thought, well, San Francisco's the job center. Melissa, we're sort of running out of time. Anything you're looking at on the local ballot that you're watching in particular?
I'm very interested in the same measures that you all have just mentioned. I think it'll be interesting to see if people do vote to approve R, to say, yes, we want to speed up the growth of affordable housing, or if, NIMBYism wins the day again and people say, well, I want housing, but I don't want it to affect me. I don't want my downtown to become more like a city. We see that all over. And I also think this is going to be impacted by the shift we've seen of people working more at home. And well, if you're working more at home and you don't have to go into the city, then maybe you'd like to find another place to live. And so maybe housing is more on your mind. So I think it's going to be super close, because I think people they enjoy complaining about the affordability of housing and the difficulty of finding a place, or for their adult children to find a place to live near them, but they don't want their lives to change. They don't want it to be in their city. And so I'm a little bit skeptical that they will, put that NIMBYism aside and vote for housing. We'll see.
Well, there's a long history of NIMBYism on the peninsula, so it'd be tough. But it's an interesting thing. It's an old curse. You live in a time of transition, but it sure makes for interesting politics. All three of us are going to be right here on election night. Kevin's going to be joining us, as is Melissa. We're all hosting together. We hope you'll join us. We're going to be talking about these races. We'll be the only place where all we're talking about is what's important to you on this election, this historic election, this landmark election. This is something that if you're young enough, you'll be talking about having been through this 25, 30, 40 years from now. It's a major, major moment in the history of our country. And because of all the things on the ballot, it's a major moment in the history of our community, and a great opportunity for us to spend some time talking to you and understanding this. We'll have lots of interviews. We'll spend a lot of time analyzing what's going on. You can tell we've got some smart folks here with Kevin and Melissa. So we hope you'll join us right here on election night. And we'll be there on behalf of Kevin Mullin and Melissa Michelson. I'm Mark Simon. Thanks for being here on The Game, and we'll see you soon.